Well, in the autumn of 1620, pilgrims set out from England in search of freedom of worship and new beginnings, among other things. They were bound for Virginia, but were thrown off course and landed in what is now Plymouth, Massachusetts, on the 11th of December. Of course, being that date, that month, winter was near, and there was little time to build living quarters. Many of them huddled aboard the Mayflower during those months as they waited for spring. A lack of food and the cold reduced their number by half before warmer weather arrived. But the ones who survived elected to stay, and they began to build and plant and eke out a living from the land. In 1621, according to tradition, as the days began to shorten again, a good harvest brought food aplenty for the coming winter. And the governor, William Bradford, proclaimed a day of thanksgiving. The transition had been tough. Losses were heavy, but the blessing of God was beginning to be felt. Now, Americans hear that story over and over again at their annual time of Thanksgiving. And in some sense, because those days preceded the American Revolution, it may also be argued that those are good words for Canadians. But we have now our own traditions, going back to Martin Frobisher and others, and this is our weekend to remember and give thanks. Remembering is such an important thing. It's a wonderful part of the gratitude process, perhaps a necessary part. I recall being very impressed with a young man, Daniel Radcliffe, as he gave an acceptance speech after receiving a star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame. And Radcliffe, of course, is perhaps better known as Harry Potter. And he has been famous from a very young age. And perhaps with all his experience, you might expect Radcliffe to take this award in stride and say, oh, whatever, no big deal. But his speech said something more significant. He was humble and he reflected on his past, and he said, if you get to work in this job, you are, by sheer virtue of statistics, one of the luckiest people on earth. And so none of us who are lucky enough to do this should ever forget that, and I promise that I won't. I was very lucky to get the part of Harry. I was lucky. I enjoyed working long hours right from the word go. And I've been lucky enough to be able to continue my career and work with people I love in the years since Potter finished. And then Radcliffe looked at his parents and he said, but the seeds of all my luck were sown at the very beginning, 26 years ago, when I got you as parents. So thank you, and I love you. And it was a very beautiful speech, remembering with a degree of realism where he had come from, how fortunate he had been. And even if he didn't attribute his success to God, he expressed gratitude for his experiences. Remembering, you see, is very much a part of being thankful. Well, we have Thanksgiving Day. And if we go back, the Hebrew people, the Israelites, they had their own memories and their own opportunities to give thanks. It was probably around 1900 BC that their forefather Abram came out of the city of Ur. There was a time when that had been a very strong city. And he and his family, they wandered north and west along probably the Tigris River Valley. And they went into what is probably modern-day Turkey, and then they turned south through Syria and went through Lebanon, what's now Israel, and finally, because of a famine, they settled in Egypt. And it was there that they were put under bondage to the Egyptians, as we've been talking about over the last couple of Sundays, and they cried out from their bondage, and God came through Moses to deliver them. And they were taken out of captivity, and then they spent 40 years in the wilderness, and then finally God brings them into this land that he had promised Abram many, many generations before. So they go into the land. And even then, life wasn't easy for them. There were small wars and divisions, and as well as just the basic jobs of getting settled and establishing homes and planting. And as they settled down and they planted their seeds and they waited under the summer sun, eventually harvest comes. And our text today speaks of what they were to do once things had settled. And it says this: when you've entered the land the Lord your God is giving you as an inheritance and have taken possession of it and have settled in it, take some of the first fruits of all that you produce from the soil of the land. Take them to the altar and declare there what the Lord has done for you. And the text sort of talks about how they rehearse the history of what they've been through and what God's done. And so here they are. They've reached the promised land, and before anything else, with their produce, they're to go and they're to make an offering, remember the past, and in light of that remembrance, give thanks to God. And there you shall worship the Lord your God and rejoice in all the good that the Lord has given you, to your house, to you, to the Levite, and the sojourner that is among you. I just think about how important remembrance is when we're to give thanks. Remembering puts us in a bigger picture, puts things in a greater light, and it's what leads to thanks. What leads to thanks. And it's not just good things and good times that we can be thankful in. There's a woman by the name of Helen Keller. Perhaps some of you have heard of her. And she pointed out that life doesn't always have to be good to be thankful. She had been blind from an early age and deaf. And yet, in the midst of these, she thanked God. She thanked God for her handicaps. She said, because through them, I found myself, and I found my work, and I found my God. There's always something to be thankful for, she said. So remembrance is important. Thanking is important. As we move further into this passage in Deuteronomy, we find that the Israelites didn't stop just with offering first fruits. Something else went on, and they went on to talk about this concept of a tithe. Now, before your hearts all go, ooh, the Old Testament isn't clear about a tithe. It just seems that it's a portion we're supposed to give back to God because God has blessed us. And some of that tithe, it seems from this passage and other passages about it, some of it is to go to the temple, some of it is to go to God's servants, some of it is to go to care for widows and orphans and the disadvantaged. And what the passage says is that God's blessing is supposed to evoke in us remembrance, and then thanks, and then giving. Giving, it's such a high ideal. To make our thanks concrete. I'll always remember a church board meeting that I was at some years ago, and that particular church was struggling financially, and the board members are reflecting about how they can increase their givings and get by, and they're talking about this and that, and they're talking about adding more programming and more activities, and maybe that will encourage people to give. And then after listening to these things for a while, one of the board members volunteered this, and he said, "You know what? It's not any of that." He said, "Giving is a spiritual thing. It's a response to God, founded in remembering what God has done for us in the past and trusting that the same God is working with us in the present and will continue with us into the future. Where God's people remember," he said, "where they give thanks and make that thanks concrete, giving isn't a problem." And I was thinking, as a pastor, I wished I'd said that. It was so well put. It reminded me of how Teddy Roosevelt once said, let's remember, as much has been given us, much will be expected from us. And true homage, it comes from the heart as well as the lips, and it shows itself in what we do, and it becomes an action. And this text sort of reveals that the blessing of God then will be upon the people. Now here we are in Canada in 2017. And we've designated this weekend in Canada to remember and offer thanks. And at a national level, we have so much going for us. Consistently, Canada is rated one of the top countries in the world to live in. And many people want to be in Canada. And many people in Canada are now immigrants. And I am one, an immigrant. I remember my family leaving a very troubled Belfast over 40 years ago, and we came with very little. And as is the experience with many immigrants, the first years are very difficult. My mother was widowed, 3 young children. Well, maybe I wasn't quite so young, but youngish. And it was difficult. But this country offers so many opportunities. And while my mother did her part, my siblings and I, we all managed to get to university and then to make our way in the workforce and with marriage, and we all now have children and in some cases grandchildren, and they are making their way now too. Of course, there have always been hiccups along the way. Most people have hiccups and difficult days, but if you look at the overall picture, the broad picture, it's a good story. It's a story of God's blessing upon a woman and her children. I remember the first Thanksgiving dinner I went to. They don't have that tradition where I came from. And we had turkey occasionally in Ireland, very, very occasionally. To have an extra time of the year when you could get turkey, that was like incredible to me. But before that, we actually were invited out. We hadn't been in Canada for very long, weeks as a matter of fact. And we had started attending this church, and some of the church people had had talked to us about Thanksgiving, and we said, well, we don't know anything about it. And they said, well, come on over to our place for Thanksgiving. And so we went. And when the food was all ready, before they ate, the host looked around the table and said, so everybody, tell us what you are thankful for. And I remember saying that I was thankful to be in Canada, having grown up with so many troubles and conflict and gangs and hatred. It was nice to be in a place of peace. But you know, today, many years later, I'm even more thankful that Canada has become our home. And as I can look back, as I was telling you about that story, I just am so thankful for the way God has cared and has guided our small family over the years. And I'm thankful as well for the last year and this transition into Belleville and the warmth that I've experienced from you as a congregation. And as I settle into another chapter in this journey of life that I'm on, I'm very thankful. And that's my story. And I wonder what yours is. You have a story too. And I wonder if this weekend you could take a little time to go through that. Not maybe the last few days or the last few months, but the broad story. And just look and see what God has done. Because I'm sure that in that you'll find a blessing.